My name is Ayatollah Reza Mahmoud Husseini, and, for 63 years, I believed I was the guardian of an absolute and unquestionable truth. I was born in 1962, in the beating heart of the holy city of Qom, Iran, where the smell of incense and the constant sound of prayers shaped every fiber of my being from childhood. I am a direct cousin of the supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, and this lineage was not just a title, but a burden of spiritual and political responsibility that I carried with blind pride. While the world saw my cousin's face on screens, I worked in the shadows, in the silent corridors of power, shaping the resistance against what we called Western poison. I did not seek the fame of cameras or the recognition of foreign journalists. My satisfaction came from knowing that, through my hands and my religious policy documents, I was protecting the purity of Islam and keeping the walls of the revolution raised against what I considered to be the moral decay of democracy and liberal freedom. Before we continue, take a moment to subscribe to the channel, activate the bell so you don't miss any testimony, and leave in the comments where you are listening to us from. It is very important to have you participating in this community. Now, let's go back to the testimony. I spent more than 35 years serving the Islamic Republic with absolute discretion and a devotion that many would consider fanatical. I was educated in the best seminaries of Qom, immersing myself for 15 years in the deep study of jurisprudence, philosophy, and the interpretation of the Quran. By the age of 17, I had already memorized every verse of the Holy Book. At 45, I was recognized as an Ayatollah, although I preferred the shadow of anonymity to advise the most sensitive branches of our government. I traveled to Damascus, Beirut, and Baghdad, participating in closed-door meetings where we decided the fate of generations, always convinced that Christians were irredeemably mistaken and that Islam was the only path to the light. I taught thousands of young people that the West was the great Satan, a cancer of materialism that needed to be eradicated. I believed, with all the strength of my soul, that we were on the right side of history, defending a fortress of pure faith against a tide of global immorality that threatened to destroy us. However, there was a secret I hid even from Zara, my devoted wife with whom I shared 38 years of life. In the depths of the night, when the lights of our home in Qom went out and the silence became heavy, a seed of fear sprouted in my chest, something I tried to stifle with prayers and rigorous fasting. In Islam, the certainty of salvation is something no one truly possesses. Everything depends on Allah's scales on the Day of Judgment. I would look at the ceiling and wonder if my decades of service, my 4 Hajjs to Mecca, and my dedication to the revolution would be enough to compensate for my hidden flaws. The fear that my good deeds were insufficient to avoid the fire of Jahannam tormented me like a cold whisper. I felt like a man building a bridge of sand over an infinite abyss, praying desperately that the wind would not blow before I reached the other side. This dread, which I called the temptation of Shaitan, was actually the first sign that the foundation of my life was about to crumble. The day of March 15, 2025, began like any other day of sacred duty, immersed in the routine of prayers before dawn. I remember the taste of the Barbary bread with feta cheese and walnuts that Zara prepared, and the hot sweet tea we drank in silence before my departure for Tehran. I had been chosen by my cousin to represent Iran's interests at a highly confidential Islamic summit in Istanbul, Turkey. It was an immense honor, a moment for which my entire life seemed to have converged. While my youngest son drove me along the highway that cuts through the flat, desert landscape, I reviewed my documents, feeling an unwavering self-confidence. The sky was a bright and cruel blue, without a single cloud to predict the disaster that awaited me. I was sitting in the back seat, absorbed in notes on economic cooperation and religious resistance, unaware that in less than an hour I would no longer be breathing, and that everything I had taught and defended for decades would be shattered by an encounter that human logic could never explain. The impact was not just a sound, it was a physical force that seemed to disintegrate reality itself around me. I was deep into a document on Islamic cooperation when my driver's desperate scream pierced the air. I looked up and saw, for a fraction of a second, the colossal metallic mass of a fuel tanker truck losing control and crossing into our lane. Everything began to happen in agonizing slow motion, where time stretched like rubber. The screech of twisting metal sounded like the roar of a prehistoric animal. I felt the car being thrown sideways, the window glass exploding into thousands of fragments that cut my skin like ice blades. My head ricocheted against the vehicle's structure, and the world spun violently. When the movement ceased, the silence that followed was worse than the noise. I was hanging upside down, trapped by the seatbelt, feeling the hot, metallic blood streaming down my eyes and mouth, while the acrid smell of gasoline flooded what remained of the crushed cabin. The pain that followed the initial adrenaline was something no medical description can faithfully capture. Every breath felt as if I were swallowing shards of glass. My ribs were shattered and my left arm hung at an impossible and unnatural angle. Outside the car, I heard screams of panic and people saying the fuel was leaking, that the vehicle could explode at any second. The terror of being burned alive, trapped in that Iranian metal sarcophagus, surpassed any physical pain. I began to cry out to Allah in silence, as I had no strength to speak, but the old fear of uncertainty returned to haunt me with renewed force. "I served you my whole life," I screamed in my mind, while frantic hands tried to force open the jammed door. I felt life draining out of me along with the blood soaking the car seat. The dread was not just of dying, but of discovering, in that final moment, that everything I had built as a respected Ayatollah was not enough to give me the peace I now desperately begged for, while the heat of the asphalt rose to suffocate me. I vaguely remember being pulled from the wreckage and laid on the highway floor. The Tehran sky above me seemed an offensively clear and calm blue in the face of the tragedy I was living. When the paramedics arrived, their voices were distant and urgent whispers, talking about plummeting blood pressure and massive internal hemorrhage. I was placed on a stretcher, and the ambulance ride was a blur of flashing lights and the shrill sound of the siren that seemed to mark the final rhythm of my heart. I drifted in and out of consciousness. I saw Zara's face. I saw my young children. I saw my cousin in our study rooms in Qom. I felt the needle of the IV pierce my arm, but the sensation was distant, as if it were happening to someone else. The paramedic next to me had wide eyes of concern as he shouted numbers into a radio. I wanted to tell him I was an Ayatollah, that I was important, that I had crucial documents for the summit in Istanbul, but my tongue was heavy and the world was turning into a gray and cold tunnel where no political influence could save me. Upon arriving at Imam Khomeini Hospital, the urgency turned into an organized chaos of ceiling lights passing rapidly over me. I was taken directly to a frigid operating room, surrounded by figures in green masks shouting orders about transfusions and abnormal heart rhythms. I felt the oxygen mask over my face and heard the doctor say I would not survive without immediate intervention due to a collapsed lung and lacerated internal organs. The anesthesiologist asked me to count backward from 10. I remember starting in Farsi. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, and then the abyss. What the medical team did not know was that, in those following minutes, my heart would stop completely. I was clinically dead. 11 minutes of absolute silence in the physical world, but of overwhelming activity in a dimension I had spent my whole life denying or distorting. I was about to discover that death was not the end of consciousness, but the beginning of a confrontation that would tear down all the pillars of my earthly existence. The darkness was not the absolute end. I felt a sudden and indescribable detachment, as if I were freeing myself from a heavy, wet, and restrictive garment that had bound me for decades. Suddenly I was floating near the ceiling of the operating room, watching the scene below with a clarity and perception that my physical eyes never possessed. I saw my own body, pale, fragile, and bloody, stretched out on the cold metal table and surrounded by complex equipment. I saw the doctors acting with a controlled and frantic desperation. One of them was pressing my chest with brutal force, performing rhythmic compressions in an attempt to bring me back, while a nurse checked the monitors that showed only flat lines and a continuous, sharp sound announcing my clinical death. What was strangest was not seeing my own death, but the deep indifference I felt toward that body. That man with the gray beard and Persian features down there seemed like a complete stranger, an empty shell that I no longer needed to exist. I began to rise steadily, passing through the ceiling and the various upper floors of the hospital, as if solid matter were nothing more than a substanceless fog. In a few seconds, I was hovering over the vast city of Tehran, feeling the fresh air and absolute freedom. I saw the chaotic traffic of the great avenues, the glow of the buildings under the sun, and the Alborz mountains in the distance, but all of that suddenly seemed tiny and insignificant to my new consciousness. The hospital became just a geometric point amid thousands of others. I rose faster and faster, propelled by an invisible, welcoming, and irresistible force. I crossed the clouds and saw the Earth's curvature revealing itself magnificently below me, a blue and majestic globe receding at an impossible speed. There was no fear at all, only an overwhelming curiosity and a peace that exceeded all human understanding. I was leaving behind the world of conflicts, politics, and borders that I had fought so hard to protect and defend. The light of the earth gradually disappeared, and I entered a space of absolute darkness, an immense vacuum that seemed to have no end or direction. However, this darkness was not cold or terrifying. It was like being wrapped in a warm and protective velvet, being carried by a presence that I could not see with my eyes, but that I felt vibrating in every atom of my new spiritual being. It was in this deep cosmic silence that sounds began to emerge softly. It was not earthly music, made of string or wind instruments, but a celestial harmony of voices, millions of them, singing in a language I had never heard, but which my soul recognized and understood perfectly at its core. The melodies were dense, pure, and charged with a joy so intense it made my whole being vibrate in resonance. It was as if the universe itself were breathing in an eternal chorus of worship. I was being pulled through this tunnel of sounds and shadows toward something that was beginning to glow intensely at the far end. As I approached that source of magnificent brilliance, the light became overwhelming and omnipresent, but strangely, it was not blinding. It was a living light that possessed its own intelligence, a light that seemed to be composed of pure love, justice, and truth. I entered a tunnel whose walls were made of pure pulsing radiation, shimmering in tones of gold and pearl that defied the entire known solar spectrum. Time, as I knew it on Earth, ceased to exist completely. There was no longer past or future, only an eternal, full, and absolute now. I felt that every fiber of that light knew me deeply, penetrating the recesses of my soul in a way I had never allowed anyone to. Suddenly I emerged on the other side of the tunnel, and my feet touched what seemed to be firm ground, but of a glorious and indescribable nature. I was in a place of a beauty that no dream could conceive, where colors possessed a depth and life that made all of Earth's nature seem like just a pale sketch. I was standing on terrain that seemed to vibrate with a life of its own, where the grass beneath my feet was of a green so deep and vivid that each blade seemed to emit its own pulse of emerald light. Gigantic flowers, with petals resembling cut gemstones, grew in abundance, exuding a fragrance that was a mixture of honey, jasmine, and something purely divine that I could not name. Colossal trees rose around me, with leaves that shimmered as if they were made of blown crystal, moving gently under a breeze that brought an inexplicable peace. I looked at my hands, and the shock was immediate. The age spots, the wrinkles of 63 years, and the scars of life had completely disappeared. My skin was smooth, my arms were strong, and I felt a vitality pulsing in my veins that I had not experienced since my youth in Qom. The terrible pain of the accident, the crushed ribs, and the collapsed lung were now just a remote and substanceless memory in the face of that perfection. I walked toward a nearby river, and the water was of such absolute transparency that I could see every detail of the bed, which glowed as if lined with diamonds. The sound of the flowing water was like constant and harmonious laughter, filling the air with a joy that seemed contagious. The sky above me did not have the common blue color of Earth, but was a soft and radiant golden hue, which seemed to be the source of all the warmth and light of that magnificent place. I tried to process all of that with my Ayatollah mind, seeking references in the Quran about the gardens of Jannah, with its rivers of milk and honey and palaces of gold. However, there was something fundamentally different there, something that did not fit the descriptions I had taught for decades. The beauty of that place was not physical or material in the sense that I understood. It was a spiritual beauty, a holiness that penetrated my bones and made me feel, for the first time in my life, that I was finally home, in a place where sin and doubt were not allowed to enter. While I was absorbing the glory of that scenery, a sudden sound captured my attention and made my heart race. Footsteps. They were calm, firm, and rhythmic footsteps, moving along the golden path just behind me. Even before I turned around, my entire being reacted to that presence in a way I had never experienced before. The air around me seemed to change instantly, becoming charged with a sacred electricity, an authority so overwhelming and, at the same time, a love so dense that my knees began to tremble involuntarily. It was not the fear I felt before the political authorities in Tehran, or the dread I harbored for the scales of Allah's judgment. It was a reverential awe, a realization that something infinitely greater than the universe was approaching. I turned slowly, feeling the weight of every second, fearing what I would find, but feeling an irresistible attraction to that light that seemed to emanate from the figure now stopping a few meters away, observing me with an intensity that pierced my soul. There he was, standing on the path, and the vision shattered any concept I had about divinity. He was a man, but his appearance transcended any human form I had ever seen. He did not just reflect light. Light emanated from within his being, radiating in soft waves that illuminated everything around with an indescribable purity. His robes were of such absolute white they seemed woven from the very glow of the sun, without any seam or imperfection. But it was his eyes that paralyzed my breath, eyes that were, at the same time, flames of pure justice and oceans of infinite compassion. I felt that, in that gaze, he saw every moment of my life, every sermon I gave against Christianity, every policy I wrote to oppress the infidels, every secret I hid in the depths of my heart. There was no place for masks or titles there. I was not the great Ayatollah, I was just Reza, a man naked before the truth. And it was in that moment that understanding hit me like a thunderbolt. The one before me was not just the prophet Isa. He was the Son of the living God, God himself incarnate in glory. The revelation that the one before me was God himself hit me with the force of a spiritual cataclysm. I fell face down on the golden floor, feeling the unbearable weight of 6 decades of lies and fierce opposition to his name. I, who had dedicated every fiber of my being to teaching that Christians were deceived idolaters, was now prostrate before the very truth I tried to erase from the face of my country. I instantly remembered every book I wrote under pseudonyms, every young person I instructed to hate the cross, and every meeting where I planned the destruction of Christian influence in Iran. The ground, though beautiful, seemed to burn my face with the shame of my sin. I was not just a deceived man, I was an architect of deception, a leader who led millions away from the only path of salvation. The tears pouring from my eyes were not just from pain, but from a repentance so deep it seemed to tear my soul apart. The silence of that moment was absolute, filled only by the sound of my own convulsive crying and the frantic throbbing of my spirit before pure holiness. While I was sobbing on the ground, a voice broke the silence, and the sound was something I would never be able to perfectly describe in any human language. It was a harmony of thunder and melody, a frequency that did not just enter my ears, but vibrated in every cell of my glorified body. "Reza," he said, calling me by name with a tenderness I never expected to receive. Hearing my name pronounced by him, I felt as if layers of pride and hardness were being torn from my heart. "Rise and look at me," continued the voice, charged with an authority that made disobedience a physical impossibility. I rose slowly, my knees still shaky, my breath short and trembling. When I finally met his eyes again, I did not see the fury I expected, the judgment of a king against a rebel. I saw a compassion that left me even more disarmed. He took a step toward me, closing the distance between the Creator and the creature, between the God I persecuted and the sinner who was now there, stripped of all his religious and political arrogance. He approached so closely that I could feel the heat emanating from his robes of light. With a gesture of infinite gentleness, he extended his hands toward me, palms facing up. My eyes were drawn to them, and, in that instant, my world collapsed for the second time. In the palms of his hands, there were deep circular scars, permanent marks of nails that had pierced flesh and bone. In Islam, I had vehemently taught that Jesus was never crucified, that Allah had taken him to heaven and placed another in his place to deceive the Jews. That was the basis of our denial of redemption. But there, before me, were the undeniable proofs of the agony he endured for love. I touched those marks with trembling fingers, feeling the texture of the scarred tissue under my skin. They were real. They were the wounds of the Lamb. The pain I felt upon realizing that I had fought against the sacrifice made for me was excruciating. Those scars spoke louder than all the volumes of Islamic jurisprudence I had studied for 15 years in the seminaries of Qom. Jesus looked deep into my eyes and asked the question that would seal my eternal destiny. "Reza, do you know who I am?" My voice, which once commanded rooms full of scholars and generals, was now just a broken and wet whisper. I swallowed hard, feeling the lump in my throat dissolve into a confession that would change everything I once represented. "You are Isa," I said first, using the name I knew in my tradition, but I immediately corrected myself, for that title was too small for what I saw. "No. You are the Lord. You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." Upon pronouncing those words, I felt as if an invisible barrier within me had exploded. All resistance, all the hatred I nurtured against the cross, all spiritual blindness were washed away in an instant. I began to cry again, but this time it was a cry of relief, of a man who had been lost in the desert for 63 years and finally found the source of living water. He smiled, and that smile illuminated the eternity around us, confirming that, despite everything I did, I was being received by the King. Yes, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me, said Jesus. And his words were not just quotes from a book, but a reality that vibrated throughout the atmosphere of that place. I felt the crushing weight of every second I spent teaching the opposite. I thought of my students in Qom, of the young people I trained to believe the cross was a blasphemous invention of men. Jesus moved even closer and placed his hands on my shoulders. The heat emanating from them was a mixture of healing and purifying fire. I died for you, Reza. I died for every lie you told, for every act of persecution you planned against my followers, for every ounce of religious pride you accumulated in 63 years. I shed my blood so that the abyss you dug could be crossed. The repentance that seized me was so physical, it felt like my chest would explode. I could not understand how he could look at me with so much love after all I had done against his kingdom, against his very memory and divinity. While I was still trying to process that incomprehensible grace, Jesus took me by the hand, and we began to walk away from that exuberant garden. The landscape began to change drastically. The golden light gave way to a heavy and thick gloom, and the perfume of the flowers was replaced by a smell of dust and emptiness. We stopped at the edge of a cliff so deep that vision could not reach the bottom, and the width was such that the other side seemed like just a thread of light in the impossible distance. Below us, in the abyss, I heard sounds that made my cold Ayatollah blood freeze even more. A collective lament, a sound of gnashing of teeth and screams of absolute despair that seemed to rise from that living darkness. This is the abyss that sin created between humanity and the Father, explained Jesus, with a sadness that seemed to carry the weight of all centuries. It is a divide that no man can leap, a hole that death dug and that religion tries, in vain, to fill with human effort. Suddenly, Jesus raised his hand, and a vision opened before me. I saw millions of people on this side of the abyss, the earth side, trying desperately to reach the light on the other side. I saw devout Muslims, men I knew, stacking their daily prayers as if they were bricks, trying to build a bridge of words to heaven. I saw others fasting to the limit of exhaustion, carrying their Ramadan sacrifices as if they were support beams. I saw scholars like me, stacking volumes of theological knowledge, books and more books of laws, trying to create a stone path over the void. However, before my horrified eyes, every one of those bridges collapsed before even reaching halfway. The prayers fell into the darkness, the works of charity crumbled like ashes, and religious knowledge proved to be as fragile as smoke in the wind. People screamed as they fell into the abyss, realizing, in the final instant, that everything they had done throughout their entire lives was not strong enough to overcome the gravity of their own sin. Terror overcame me as I saw familiar faces, men who were my teachers, falling into that eternal vacuum. "Why is nothing working?" I cried in despair, tears flowing uncontrollably. They were so dedicated. They prayed, fasted, and gave everything they had. Jesus looked at me with infinite compassion and answered, "Because the bridge is made of sin, Reza, and nothing that comes from an impure heart can touch the holiness of God. Prayers are stained by pride. Fasting is corrupted by self-sufficiency. Charity is polluted by the desire for recognition. There is no human work perfect enough to unite man to the Creator." He then walked to the exact edge of the precipice and opened his arms. I saw as his body, in a mystery of light and pain, seemed to stretch across the entire span of that impossible abyss. His feet were firmly planted on the earth side, and his hands reached the Father's side. In that moment, he became the bridge, the only solid and radiant structure over which people could walk safely to the light, carrying nothing but faith. I saw figures crossing that body of light, the only bridge over the void. What haunted me most was realizing they carried no burdens, no piles of alms coins, no scrolls of religious knowledge. They simply walked, some running, others almost crawling, but all moved by a confidence I had never felt in my religious life. "Who are these?" I asked, my voice choked with shock. Jesus, who was now beside me again, answered with a voice that seemed to embrace the entire universe. "These are the ones who stopped trying to build their own bridges. They understood they could not save themselves and accepted what I did for them. They confessed their sins and simply stepped onto the bridge of my grace." I felt my Ayatollah pride melt like wax in a fire. Everything I had built as a personal merit was rubbish before that absolute truth. Salvation was not my achievement, but a gift from him that I had spent my whole life refusing and fighting. He extended his hands again and allowed me to see the marks in his feet and the wound in his side. "I did not just stretch over the abyss, Reza. I died upon it," he said, and the gravity of his words made my heart fail. In Iran, we said the crucifixion was a historical farce, a myth invented to corrupt faith. But there, in the presence of eternity, the lie I taught for decades became an unbearable weight upon my shoulders. He described the moment the Roman soldiers drove the nails, the agony of 6 hours hanging on that wooden cross, the weight of every human sin being placed upon his pure shoulders. "I paid the debt you and your people owed, but could never pay," Jesus stated. "I felt the depth of my error in every cell of my body. All my study in Qom, all the memorization of the Quran, all my lectures and books against the cross were nothing more than a useless and dangerous effort to keep people away from the only safe harbor that exists." Guilt hit me with the force of an avalanche. I fell to my knees again, sobbing in a way I didn't think a spirit could cry. "What have I done?" I screamed between sobs, my face pressed against the floor that vibrated with His holiness. I thought of my students, the thousands of young people who looked to me for spiritual guidance and whom I directed toward the abyss. I thought of the books I wrote, the laws I helped draft, the words I used to convince millions of Iranians that Jesus was just a man, a minor prophet who never died for anyone. I was a murderer of souls. The awareness that I had actively worked so that those people would fall into the precipice was a torture worse than any physical pain from the accident on the road. 63 years of life, and I had spent every day building obstacles before the only door to heaven. I felt unworthy to be there, wishing only that the abyss would swallow me so I wouldn't have to face such betrayal against my own Creator. It was then that Jesus knelt beside me, in the middle of that gloom that still surrounded the vision of the abyss, and wrapped me in an embrace that seemed to rebuild my shattered soul. He did not rebuke me for my past, nor did He give me a list of my failures, although He knew them all. "Reza," He whispered, and the sound of my name in His voice was like balm on an open wound. "I did not bring you here to condemn you. I brought you because I love you. I have always loved you, even when you wrote against me, even when you hated my followers, even when you closed the doors of your country to my message. My blood is powerful enough to wash away even your sins." I looked up and saw tears in His eyes. In that moment, I understood that grace makes no sense to human logic, especially to the logic of religious law. He was forgiving me completely, wiping clean my 63-year history of rebellion and offering me a new life I could never deserve or pay for. Jesus led me away from the abyss, and the landscape changed once more, becoming a majesty that made the initial garden seem like just a prelude. We stopped before a colossal door, so high the top was lost in the golden glow of the celestial firmament. It was made of a substance that looked like a weave of pure crystal with threads of living gold, emitting a rhythmic pulse of light that echoed like the heartbeat of eternity itself. But as I watched it, a shiver of spiritual terror ran through my glorified being. The door, although open about 2/3 of the way, was moving. It was an almost imperceptible movement, slow as the growth of a tree, but inexorable and constant. It was closing. Every inch lost seemed to diminish the spiritual oxygen of that space, creating an urgency I could not put into words. The beauty of the door was eclipsed by the horror of its imminent closure. Something I felt was the end of an era of mercy that humanity had enjoyed for centuries without ever understanding its fragility. I looked at Jesus, and what I saw scared me more than the vision of the abyss. The King of Glory was weeping. Heavy, bright tears fell down His face, dropping onto the golden ground like pearls of infinite pain. "This is the door of grace, Reza," He said, and His voice was laden with the weight of 1,000 oceans of sadness. "For centuries I have kept it wide open for all peoples, tribes, and tongues. I called the Muslims, the Hindus, the Buddhists, the atheists, and even those who used my name for their own ends. I knocked on the door of billions of hearts, whispering about my sacrifice and my love. But humanity, for the most part, chose its own pride and its empty traditions. They preferred to build their bridges of sand at the precipice rather than accept the bridge I became on the cross." He reached out toward the door that continued to move silently. "Man's rebellion has a limit, not because my love changes, but because my holiness demands that the season of invitation reach an end determined by the Father." Jesus then fixed His eyes on mine with an urgency that seemed to burn my conscience. "Pay attention to what I am going to tell you, for Earth's time is running faster than you imagine. This door will remain open as it is until the end of the year 2026. That is the limit set for the fullness of grace. I felt a shock run through my being hearing such a near and specific date. After the close of 2026, the door will close halfway, and what is today a clear invitation will become a muffled cry. It will be much harder for people to find me. Hearts will become like iron stones, and the conviction of my spirit will be less felt upon the face of the earth. The world will enter a period of voluntary blindness and spiritual hardening that has never been seen since creation. The year 2026 is the last great opportunity for nations to turn to me before the earth's atmosphere changes forever and judgment begins to manifest physically and spiritually upon all who rejected the truth. Suddenly, we were transported to a point above the earth, and Jesus allowed me to see what would happen after that time marker. I saw the planet plunged into a chaos that the human mind cannot process without going insane. Wars exploded on every continent, where neighbors killed neighbors, and betrayal became the current currency. I saw clouds of black smoke from nuclear explosions and entire cities being reduced to ashes in minutes. The earth groaned and split open in colossal earthquakes, and oceans rose like mountains to sweep away civilization. But the worst was not the physical destruction, it was the emptiness in people's eyes. They cried out to gods who could not answer, trapped in religions that were now just empty shells of power and lies. "You must go back, Reza," said Jesus, his hand heavy and firm on my shoulder. "You must warn the Iranians, the Muslims, and the whole world. Tell them the door is closing. Tell them 2026 is the limit. I send you back not to condemn them, but to give them a last breath of mercy before the silence of judgment falls upon the earth." The light around Jesus still echoed like soft thunder in my consciousness when the force of gravity began to pull me violently backward. I felt a free fall, a vacuum sucking me away from that indescribable glory, and suddenly, the weight of physical existence hit me like an iron hammer. The first sensation was a searing pain in my chest, where surgeons had sawed my bones to try to restart my heart that had stopped completely. The air entering my lungs burned like fire, and the smell of antiseptic and blood took the place of the celestial perfume of the flowers. I opened my eyes and the fluorescent light of Imam Khomeini Hospital seemed a gray insult to the beauty I had just left. I heard the alarm of the machine's changing rhythm and a female voice screaming, in Farsi, that I was back. One of the doctors, with eyes wide with pure scientific dread, repeated endlessly that I had been dead for 11 minutes, without pulse and without brain activity, a miracle his science could never explain. I spent 3 weeks in that hospital, subjected to an incessant battery of exams, MRIs, and neurological tests. Specialists came from all over Iran to look at the man who had resurrected, trying to find permanent damage in my brain or heart, but they found nothing but perfect health that defied the logic of modern medicine. During those days, I maintained absolute silence about what I lived, observing the nurses and doctors with deep sadness, knowing that many of them were building those sand bridges I saw collapse in the abyss. I looked at the prayers they made around me and felt an overwhelming urge to scream the truth, but the weight of my title as Ayatollah and the awareness of the consequences made me hesitate. However, the fire Jesus placed in my chest was impossible to extinguish. Every beat of my recovered heart seemed to say a name I had spent 63 years trying to bury and fight with all my might. When I was finally discharged and went to my home in Qom, I gathered my family in the room where we prayed together for decades. I saw Zara's face, marked by concern, and the proud eyes of my 3 sons and my daughter. With a trembling voice, but with a firmness that did not come from me, I told everything. The accident, the death, the encounter with the Son of God, the bridge of light, and the door that is closing in 2026. The silence that followed was the most painful of my life. My oldest son, who works in government security, stood up with a face red with fury and shame, saying the medication had melted my brain and that I needed to be committed to an asylum. Zara, the woman I loved for almost 40 years, recoiled as if I were a leper, whispering that I was committing blasphemy and that I would be killed for such words. "Jesus is the only way, Zara," I said with tears in my eyes, "and I would rather die for the truth than live one more day in the lie that almost led me to hell." The consequences were swift and brutal, as I already expected in the depths of my soul. In a matter of days, the news that an Ayatollah, cousin of the supreme leader, had converted to Christianity spread like wildfire through Tehran. I was stripped of all my titles, my accounts were blocked, and I was declared an apostate by the religious council, which in my country means an immediate death sentence. My own family disowned me publicly, and my wife asked for a divorce, declaring that her husband had died in the accident. and that the man who returned was a demon. I had to flee in the middle of the night, guided by Christians from the underground church who risked their lives to take me through the mountains to the border with Turkey. I left behind 63 years of history, wealth, and influence to become a nameless refugee in a foreign country. But I have never felt so rich or secure, for I now walk upon the bridge Jesus showed me, knowing that time is running out for the world. Today I live in a small apartment in a city I cannot name, in a country that welcomed me, but where I am still a stranger. The walls are peeling and the winter cold penetrates through the cracks in the windows, a brutal contrast to the palaces and gardens I frequented in Tehran. But every time I close my eyes, I still feel the warmth of those hands on my shoulders and the vibration of the voice that called me by name. I no longer have the Istanbul summit documents. I no longer have the respect of the clerics or the protection of my cousin, the most powerful man in Iran. All that I was erased by my own confession, but what I received in return is an inheritance that no government can confiscate. I spend my days in prayer and recording these words, feeling an urgency that consumes my insides like a physical fire. The year 2026 is knocking at the door, and I can hear the metallic and spiritual sound of that immense entrance moving inch by inch. Every sunrise is a reminder that the window of opportunity for humanity is narrowing, and I cannot afford to rest as long as there is a single soul willing to hear about the bridge that crosses the abyss. To you who hear me now, especially if you grew up like I did, believing that your devotion, your fasting, and your 5 daily prayers would be your passport to paradise, I ask you to stop for a moment and look into your heart. I saw the bridges you are building. I saw the bridges I myself built with pride for more than 63 years, and I saw all of them collapsing into the absolute void. Islam cannot save you, Muhammad cannot save you, and no amount of good works can close the hole that sin has dug between you and the Holy God. You are trying to walk on quicksand, while the King of Glory stands with open arms, having become the only bridge of flesh and blood on the cross. Do not trust in rituals that leave your soul thirsty and your spirit in doubt until the last breath. I have been on the other side. I have smelled eternity, and I have seen the fate of those who reject the Son. The time of works is over. The time of grace still breathes, but its breath is getting short. Do not wait for the door to close to discover that your religion was just a burden too heavy to carry over the precipice. Jesus told me clearly, 2026 is the last year of full grace. I do not know what will happen on the first day of 2027, but I saw the darkness that will begin to seep into the world after that door moves halfway. If you feel a tightness in your chest now, a shiver down your spine, or a sudden urge to cry, do not ignore it. It is the Spirit of God knocking on your door before the latch closes. You can accept this sacrifice right now, wherever you are. Tell Him that you are a sinner, that your works are insufficient, and that you accept His blood as the only payment for your debt. I made that choice while the blood from the accident was still drying on my face, and I have never been the same. Repentance is not a sign of weakness, but the greatest act of bravery a man can perform. Give your life to Jesus Christ today, before the calendar changes and the world plunges into the final turmoil I saw from above. The bridge is still there, firm and radiant, waiting for your tired feet to take you to the only place where love is absolute and peace is eternal. To this day, when I wake up in the middle of the night, I feel the place in my chest where my heart stopped beating for 11 minutes. Sometimes the sensation is so real, it feels as if I were still floating over that operating room in Tehran, looking at the old Reza who died there. Doctors keep sending me messages, talking about near-death syndrome and cerebral hallucinations from hypoxia, but I just smile with a melancholy they will never understand. How to explain the logic of a man who sees scars in divine hands? How to describe the sound of a door that is not made of wood, but that decides the fate of billions? The truth is that I no longer belong fully to this world. I am just a shadow carrying a message of light. The awe of that vision remains tattooed on my soul like a mark that no medicine or philosophy can erase. My task is almost complete, and the warning has been given. The silence I feel now is not the emptiness of death, but the expectation of what is to come. Suddenly the sense of presence intensifies, the air in the room cools, and the sound of the clock on the wall seems to stop. It is as if the invitation has ended, and the mystery is about to close again. I have done my part. The rest is now between you and the King who sent me.
Time is running out. If the door of grace closed today, would you be on the inside or the outside? I want to read you. What did this testimony awaken in your heart? Leave your experience or opinion in the comments. Take a moment now to subscribe to the channel and activate notifications. This is fundamental so that you receive our next alerts and transformative content. Stay with God, and until next time.